To introduce Afshin Zilanawala, a recent member of our department, one of the most recent members of our department. We're very happy that she has joined us. And today she's going to be presenting work on non-standard work, which, as I understand, Afshin, most of your work has been on fathers previously. So this time you're switching to mothers, non-standard work. So I'm really looking forward to seeing your latest research developments. So I will hand the floor over to you.
Thanks so much, Brianna. Great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Brianna. Brianna has given a bit of a prelude. So today I'm going to talk about mothers, non-standard work schedules, economic hardship, and children's development. This is work with my colleague Annika Schenk-Fontaine, and we actually just submitted this paper as a revision, and so we're really actually looking forward to any comments, feedback on all the elements that you see today. One of the motivations behind our work was Jeanette Navarro, who was a Starbucks barista in 2014. She was featured in this New York Times article. And in this article, she talked about working anything but 9 to 5, which was regularly working evenings and weekends for her. And she was facing, I would say, this logistical puzzle of integrating her work and family life, and particularly arranging childcare when she's working in the evenings and weekends, and making time for her kid. So having these sort of regular bedtimes and reading to her kid, inputs that are really important for children's development. The other feature about Jeanette that we were interested in was not just the time of day and the day of the week that she was working, but also we were interested in the fact that she was a low-wage worker. So is there this dual challenge of working these unsociable work hours and how that's important for you, your family, and your children, but is it also this added burden and challenge of working at these odd hours and having compromised economic circumstances? We, of course, were always also motivated from an academic perspective about non-standard work schedules, which have proliferated in post-industrialized nations. And for a number of reasons, they've proliferated. So this is regularly working in the evenings, nights, and or weekends is how we've defined it. And for the most part, economies have shifted towards more service-based economies, and also the results of the forces of globalization and sort of the demand of 24-hour service. But also, if we look at, let's say in the last 10 years, industries that have been the fastest growing, so retail, hospitality, those are the industries in which we find non-standard work schedules to be the most common. And these work schedules, like Jeanette, are common among parents of young children and low-wage workers. And so that means, what are the implications for child well-being and for family dynamics and processes? So for the most part, so my co-author and I, we took this deep dive into the literature focusing on early childhood, and we found that there was a fair bit of mixed evidence. And so we wanted to come in and say, well, what are the nuances and complexities that we're finding in the literature such that we can make a contribution? So one of the features that we found was that there was this limited role in understanding economic hardship. And there was a very sort of isolated view of how to define economic hardship, which I will further discuss. So we felt like there was something about non-standard work schedules that was missing. Is it the work schedule per se? Is it the work schedule in combination with perhaps having limited financial resources, and that's problematic for children and for families? And the last key motivation was that outside of, let's say, the last few years, the bulk of the research over the last decade has mostly focused on the US context. So arguably, the US context is more limited in terms of family policy supports, as well as policies that support working families, and in fact, just workers in general. I would say that there are more policies in place in the UK that buffer the employee from the harshness of the labor force. So our question was, well, are the findings from the US universal? So that takes us to the attendant research questions. So the first question we have, which really builds on sort of the research, was, are mothers' non-standard work schedules in early childhood, are they linked with child outcomes at age 5? And I'm cheating here because there's actually 2 questions within this first research objective, and that's, are the associations contemporaneous or are they delayed? So what I mean by this is, are today's work schedules affecting child outcomes today? Or is there this delayed, lingering effect from, let's say, mothers' work schedules from 1 to 2 years earlier? And that's really where the story is. And then our second and third research questions, I think, are our strongest contributions to the literature. So the second one is this descriptive element. What are the economic circumstances of mothers who work non-standard schedules? And here it's just sort of thinking broadly and conceptualizing, what do we mean by economic hardship? And so we try to add to that literature base. And then we say, lastly, well, is the relationship between work schedules and child outcomes, is it contingent on economic hardship? So we answer these questions. First, I want to tell you, though, a little bit more about our conceptual modeling, our conceptual and theoretical framework. So we spent a lot of time thinking about this. So I'm hoping we've made a stronger argument in the paper, but hopefully we've made a strong argument to you as well. So one of the models that really supports our research questions, is the family stress model. And this is built on the gods, Conger and Elder, who did a lot of work on rural poverty in America. And what they broadly and briefly argue is, on the left-hand side, economic pressures and poverty are really influential because they affect parents' relationship with each other. They affect parents' psychological strains, psychological well-being, and then those in turn affect the relationship parents have with their children, and then that in turn affects child outcomes. So we're leveraging these links to support our research, but there are 2 things that we draw on from this model to support our research, which is, Conger and Elder said, well, it's not just income. There's actually other features about economic circumstances that are important, things like material deprivation. So not having enough money to meet your basic needs, living in inadequate housing, foregone consumption of food so that your child can eat, but also this element around stress and the psychological capacity that you have that's affected when you face economic pressures. So that psychological element of economic hardship. So we don't look at these mediators, but we leverage the support of the research base that uses this model to underline that economic hardship can affect child outcomes. So we use this in coupled with our second sort of conceptual background, which is this model, or rather framework, called Conceptual Resources Framework. So I'm telling you about this because this is quite consistently used specifically in the non-standard work literature. So in the literature, this is used finding, sort of, does non-standard work affect child development? Is it working through this middle section, this blue, family resources? So this child developmentalist, Jeannie Brooks Gunn, and her colleagues, they took the ecological model, the ecological theory, and kind of reframed it and focused on family resources outlined with time, income, human capital, parental education, for example, and psychological capital, and said, well, these are the resources that families have. They have a mix of these resources. They might have a few, they might have a lot more, depending also on the age of the child. And parents make decisions. They make decisions and make trade-offs. So they might take up a job that provides, for example, considerable income, and it might be a non-standard schedule, but they compromise on the time they have with their children. Or maybe they compromise on psychological capital in order to increase the time they have with their children. And so there's this decision-making process that occurs with parents, and we're sort of leveraging that to support our question that work schedules affect child development, but we're bringing in the insights from the previous model, family stress model, to say, well, can we expand on this and not just focus on income, but look at other markers of economic hardship? So that's what we do in this study. So I want to briefly tell you about sort of two strands of research, that evidence-based and how we develop it, before diving into the data, methods, and results. So in this long literature of non-standard work and child development, we took this deep dive, as I mentioned, and we broadly found that there's mixed findings. So there's, a set of papers that say, well, these work schedules they're bad for kids. Children have worse behavior. They're more aggressive. They're more withdrawn. They're more anxious. And then in the last couple of years, there's been a set of papers that say, well, there's actually fewer behavioral problems, and children actually accrue these benefits when their parents work non-standard schedules, and they accrue these benefits when they're younger. So coming back to sort of our time period of interest, early childhood. And then there's a set of papers that say, well, there's no relationship between work schedules and child behavior. And I'm not getting into the details of the data and the methodology used here, but that's also, of course, a background element. And then there's most of the papers, they focus on child behavior, but and there's less evidence on cognitive outcomes. So one of the contributions we make is looking at a breadth of outcomes, including cognitive outcomes, and providing hopefully some fresh evidence. And then another sort of element of the literature that was interesting to us was that there's there's a handful of papers that say, well, it's not about contemporaneous work, but there's this delayed effect, there's this lagged effect of work schedules on children's outcomes, and it takes time. Work schedules affect a mother's time with her kid, as we saw with Jeanette Navarro, reading to the child, which affects language development and expressive language, and that in turn shows up in a child's test scores 1 to 2 years later. So there's this argument being made. So we bring that into our study. And then broadly, what's our take on sort of all these findings in general, and what do we make of it to strengthen our contribution? So one is that there's some clues that country context might matter, and that's because some of the evidence that says, well, it's not bad for kids, or that these work schedules are really not related to child outcomes, they come from outside the US. But secondly, and I think hopefully the stronger contribution of our study is that there are these nuances when we look at some of the papers that look at mediators and look at sort of subgroups of families. Perhaps there are families that are experiencing fewer, I would say, social resources and financial resources. And so having fewer resources means they can't buffer against the potential adverse effects of non-standard work schedules. And so we focus on economic hardship as a potential moderator. And that takes me to sort of the second broad literature base that we're drawing on for our questions. So we conceptualize in our paper that economic hardship has 3 distinct dimensions. And so first, a quite well-known one is income poverty, and that captures resources. sort of inflow of cash, earnings, wages. There's also two other elements. One is material hardship. So material hardship, I would say, is sort of the measure of concrete adversities. Do you have enough money to pay your bills, to buy shoes and a coat for your children? Do you have inadequate housing? Are you experiencing food hardship? So these are sort of the lived experience of everyday economic hardship. And then there's the third element, which is going back to the family stress model, which is the subjective element, your sort of self-evaluation of your financial capabilities, financial resources, and how well you're managing. These three, we argue, give a more sort of holistic view of a family's economic circumstances. Partly that's because some of the literature that just looks at these three measures says the correlation between these three, among these three, is quite minimal. It's anywhere between 0.15 and 0.35. So there's evidence, for example, that a family may not be income poor, but might experience financial stress subjectively. So the research based on sort of work schedules and economic hardship is quite minimal, and some descriptive evidence finds that about 2/3 of workers with these work schedules have wages below the median, and this is using US Census data and the sort of latest that we could find. And then going back to sort of the literature on child development and bringing these two strands together, there's couple of studies that say, well, these work schedules, that they're bad for kids, they're worse for child behavior, worse for cognitive outcomes, but we find quite strong effect sizes in income poor families. And so what we do is we say, well, we're going to leverage this and build on this because it's instructive. Maybe there's something about subgroups of families that experience compromised economic circumstances, but we're going to add to this and say more about these two other measures of economic hardship to give a holistic picture. And the other thing I just wanted to say was that some of this evidence on work schedules being worse for kids and income poor families, I think it's limited also when they use samples that are just focused on families below poverty, only in that I think we came in feeling like our question is, if we look at two mothers and one's working a non-standard work schedule and the other one is also working a non-standard work schedule, but one is experiencing economic hardship and the other one isn't, is that extra sort of burden, is there a dual challenge there that's worse for families? So that's the kind of question that we're trying to answer here with our third research objective. So where does that take us? We're using the Millennium Cohort Study, which is a longitudinal birth cohort study of about 18,000 births in the UK. They oversample low income and ethnic minority families. Our sample is focused on employed mothers, and the reason why we only look at employed mothers is because we're interested in characteristics about employment. And we draw on data from the second and third waves, so that's when children are age 3 and 5. We do not restrict on mothers who are consistently employed, so they might be employed at one wave but not the other. And these mothers also report on their non-standard work schedules, which I'll talk about in a bit. And then we leverage the range of outcomes that are available at age 5, which encompass broadly verbal, spatial, and child behavioral outcomes. And then, of course, these data are ideal because there is information about mothers' work schedules and also their children's outcomes, but also we've got these 3 economic hardship variables that we are considering as interactions and moderators. So our analyses are fairly simple. So we're using ordinary least square regressions. We're using lag-dependent variable models, so also known as residualized change models. So in this case, we are predicting outcomes at age 5 and from mothers' work schedules, and we adjust for a previous wave of children's outcomes, leveraging sort of that's a proxy for unobservable characteristics, but also potentially a proxy for why mothers might select themselves into a particular type of employment. I won't go into too much detail about the baseline controls, but they're the usual suspects around demographic characteristics about mothers and some household characteristics. So we account for item and unit non-response. So we take care of item missingness by using full information maximum likelihood. Gives us these 2 different samples at ages 3 and 5. And we use the survey weights to account for the probability of someone being interviewed at a particular wave, but also the sample design because of this oversampling that was done with MCS. So I want to tell you a bit about the key variable of interest, which is non-standard work schedules. And these were assessed at ages 3 and 5, as well as other waves, but we're just talking about these 2 today. So if mothers report that they were working last week, they then are asked, well, did you regularly work, that is daily or weekly? Did you regularly work in the evenings, nights, and or weekends? Those sort of time frames that are in the parentheses are predetermined categories, so they're not ones that we have selected. So a couple of things about these questions. The respondent can choose more than one schedule, so you can choose evenings, nights, and weekends if you are someone who works all those schedules. And I'll talk a little bit about that with some supplementary analyses we did. And then secondly, so the questions are asked in a way that's really similar to other birth cohort data that also uses these questions to look at child development. So at least we are in line with some of the other survey data that are out there. And there's very little difference in sort of those start and stop times that you see in the parentheses. So if a mom says that she's working at the interview, but she says no to the aforementioned schedules, we classify her as standard. So it's a binary measure, non-standard versus the reference category, which is standard. I also think this is a typical way of how this variable is constructed, again, compared to other literature that uses these types of questions. So we're at least similar to the literature, but I would say it's also limited because we're assuming that a mother who works, a standard schedule, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, we're assuming that she's untouched by any of the non-standard hours, and that may not be true. And actually, I would argue it's probably not true if we think about the modern worker in the service industry, for example. So I realize I'm criticizing my variables before I've presented the results, but it's fair. So the prevalence of these work schedules, it's a little over 40%. So among employed mothers at age 3, about 46% are working any non-standard schedule regularly, and it goes down to about 43% at age 5. Really similar prevalences at the other ages where these data are available. The most common type of non-standard schedule is evenings, and the least common is night schedules, arguably the most onerous. So economic hardship, so how do we assess that? So income poverty is a binary measure. It's constructed by the data maintenance team, just using the definition of UK poverty, family income below 60% of the median. So material hardship is a binary measure. We've constructed it as a binary measure of any material hardship. The data that we use is consistently asked at these 2 ages, 3 and 5. And there are a set of questions that ask about, are you behind on your utility bill payments? So are you behind on your electricity bill, your gas bill? Do you have overcrowding defined as having more than one person per room? evidence of damp, not being able to afford a warm coat for a child, and no central heating. So if a mother said yes to any of these, we classify her as having any hardship. The limitation of this compared to other data where I've used material hardship is there's no assessment of food hardship. For example, did you skip a meal so that your child could eat? Did you go hungry? So we don't have that. And then lastly, subjective financial stress. So there's a question that asks a Likert 5-item scale, asking the respondent, asking the mother to assess how well she's managing financially. And the top end is finding it very difficult, which is what we classify as financial stress, compared to the reference category of making ends meet, living comfortably. So the prevalence of these three, prevalence of poverty, this is again employed mothers at age 5. So the prevalence of income poverty is about 13%, 7% for financial stress, and about 14% for material hardship. Really similar prevalence at age 3 as well. And then lastly, just before we get into the results, so child development at age 5, we leverage verbal and spatial and behavioral outcomes, which are considered sort of the constellation of school readiness measures because they're really important predictors of children's academic outcomes, as well as their social and emotional outcomes in adolescence, as well as in adulthood. So at age 5, children are assessed on their verbal abilities, expressive language, which is a key component of language development, 2 assessments of their nonverbal reasoning, what we call spatial, and then children's behavior, which is assessed from externalizing and internalizing. So externalizing is, so push, pull, kick, being aggressive. And then internalizing is when a child is withdrawn, sad, depressed. I should have mentioned that the verbal and spatial scores, higher scores reflect positively, and then higher scores on behavior reflect poorly, so worse outcomes. So these were all on different scales, and we just put them onto Z-scores with standardized. So to remind you of what our first research question was, we were really interested in looking at this question that's been asked in the literature and mostly in the US, which is, what's the link between mothers' non-standard work schedules and their children's development? And we looked at this contemporaneously and also delayed. So I'm showing you results of the delayed effects. So non-standard work schedules at age 3, predicting the 5 child outcomes at age 5. So these are standardized, so they're in standard deviations, and we have the 5 outcomes on the x-axis, and these regressions are adjusting for child outcomes, lagged child outcomes, as well as baseline controls. And the key finding we have here is that children whose mothers work non-standard work schedules at age 3 have lower verbal scores at age 5. Really small effect sizes, suggesting small associations between work and verbal scores. We didn't find any other statistically significant associations with child outcomes between non-standard work at age 3. And then we also did this with contemporaneous, so non-standard work at age 5 and outcomes at age 5. So again, our 5 outcomes on the x-axis, and our key finding here was that work schedules at age 5 were children whose mothers work at non-standard hours relative to children whose mothers work standard schedules had higher internalizing scores. Again, small effect sizes, less than 0.2, and no other significant associations with other outcomes. So just kind of summarizing this first part of our results and a bit of other analyses that we did, but I'm not showing you. So generally we found that these work schedules, relative to standard schedules, children had this delayed effect with their verbal scores, and they had lower verbal scores. And we found this contemporaneous association with higher internalizing scores at age 5. So our effect sizes were really small, and taking a look at the literature from, let's say, the last 10 years, I would say the effect sizes range. Generally quite small, certainly less than 0.2, but I would say the maximum we've seen is about 0.25. So I would say the range is anywhere between 0.1 and 0.25, broadly speaking. So when we went down this path of looking at these questions, we were really excited, and we were chasing, we went down the sort of with the empirical hat on, and we were interested also in whether or not non-standard work schedules at 9 months, which is the first wave of data collection, was related to child outcomes at age 5, and the answer there is no. And the reason why we did this actually was because there's some evidence about delayed effects, and some of that evidence comes from work schedules assessed in that first year of a child's life. But I think, subsequently we believe our results, because I think there's a long arm from 9 months to age 5, and it's a little bit too much of a burden to say, well, we think mothers' work schedules, in fact, a lot of other things that happen in the first year of life have a strong effect at age 5, given everything else that happens in between those ages. So we looked at that. There were no associations. We adjusted for mothers' relationship status. So we, of course, want to give attention to the fact that relationship status matters for work schedules and family dynamics, as well as child development. So whether or not she was single, married, cohabiting. But we also thought, well, it matters what he's doing too, if he's working. So we just did sort of a simple, is he working or not, his status, as opposed to his hours. So we adjusted for that, and that didn't make a difference. And that was contemporaneous to the independent variable that we were looking at. So when we looked at age 3 work schedules, we adjusted for fathers' work schedules at age 3. So going back to the first slide I showed you, Jeanette Navarro, our Starbucks barista, she was someone who worked multiple non-standard work schedules. She worked in the evenings and she worked in the weekends. And so we had sort of, going back to our sort of conceptual model, we thought that if you work more than one non-standard work schedule, that's what's really logistically difficult. Those are the sort of mental gymnastics of having to find childcare, organize your life, and organize your children's life. And for her, there was this bit of unpredictability. And so we thought we could proxy for that by capturing mothers who work more than one type of non-standard work schedule, and then also working in isolation, and then the reference category being mothers who work standard schedules. And so we did this, and we didn't find anything that would change our conclusions. For example, we didn't see strong effect sizes for multiple non-standard work schedules, nor do we see that much difference between multiple and one type in isolation. And actually, and I realize I'm providing all these limitations to these data as I'm talking about it, but I don't think these data are ideal to look at unpredictability, but it was a good exercise nonetheless. So our second half is looking at mothers' economic circumstances and whether or not that matters for children's outcomes. So just kind of descriptively telling you about this combination of non-standard work schedules and economic hardship. It's covering my slide. Okay, this is age 3. I had a little bit of notification at the top. I couldn't see what age I was looking at. So this is age 3. Mothers who work non-standard schedules in the red, they have higher levels of poverty, financial stress, and material hardship. And these are significant differences in terms of just the prevalence estimates. really similar at age 5, except fewer significant differences, but higher magnitude among those who are working non-standard schedules. So what we do here then is we do interaction models, and we predict child outcomes from the interaction between work schedules and each of those economic hardships. We do them separately. So I'm showing you results for interaction models that predict age 5. Actually, this is internalizing behaviors that are standardized from interaction models at age 5. These are predicted means from those interaction models. Predicted means are far more capable for me instead of regression coefficients. And so the interactions were significant. The interaction was significant. And so these are predicted means for each of those 4 groups that we're interested in. Mothers who work non-standard on the left-hand side versus mothers who work standard. And then within those, the subgroups of those who experience financial stress and those who don't. So internalizing scores higher is worse. And so our key finding here was, on the left-hand side, the red point is that children of mothers who work non-standard schedules, if mothers report financial stress, they have more internalizing problems compared to their peer who doesn't experience financial stress. So these are the 2 mothers that we were really interested going into this work. Both work non-standard schedules, but one has economic hardship and one doesn't. And we find that to be different. But we also find that those significant differences also exist between mothers who have non-standard schedules and have financial stress compared to their peers who work standard schedules, irrespective of experiencing financial stress. So what else did we do? One thing I want to say is that we had larger effect sizes in our interaction models. It was about triple the effect size from the models without an interaction, suggesting relatively larger associations between work schedules and child outcomes. We didn't find any significant interactions with income poverty and material hardship. And we didn't find any lagged effects. So we only found this one contemporaneous association. And there's different ways to operationalize financial stress and material hardship. We use them as a binary measure, and we then converted them to a continuous measure. So with material hardship, we used it as a sum score. With financial stress, we used the sort of 0 through 4 scale, and our findings were robust to those different operationalizations of economic hardship. So that brings me to 2 sort of slides on conclusionary points. One is sort of the first half of our results, which was just about work and child development. And as you recall, we found that work schedules at age 3 were associated with lower verbal scores at age 5. And we also found concurrent associations between work and higher scores, internalizing scores at age 5. So our story is more on the negative side. So we found sort of negative outcomes for children. I just want to briefly say a couple of things. There's a lot to sort of we could talk about, but I wanted to focus on the effect sizes. So we had small effect sizes, and this is we've had a few reflections about this and sort of why and does it matter. And so going back to sort of our reference category here and the policy context, we have 2 mothers. One works a non-standard schedule and one works a standard schedule. Both are in the same policy context. They both, for example, are facing the same flexible work schedule policies and the same family support policies. So for example, both mothers can ask their employer, have the right to ask their employer for fewer work hours or change their work schedule. So that could be one reason why we might see smaller effect sizes, is we're comparing a reference category that, although a standard schedule mother might be untouched by these unsociable hours, she still has the same flexible work policies. But also there's some evidence around if you're in a context where there's generous paid and unpaid leave policies like there are in the UK relative to other contexts, having that generosity could, it increases your your perception of how much control you have of your work schedule. And if you have this heightened perception, you're better able to integrate work and family life. For the sake of time, I won't go through too much of this, but so I think broadly we consider these lower bound estimates. And of all, the thing I want to say about legislative feasibility and actually probably political feasibility is that if you look at the myriad of factors that affect children's lives, and I think there are certainly some that have higher effect sizes, where can we actually intervene? I would probably argue that employment is more politically and legislatively feasible, and possibly an opportunity to intervene at not just the sort of federal national government level, but also at the employer level. And this is my last conclusionary slide about economic hardship. So one thing we found was that these work schedules are related to descriptively greater economic hardship. And our story came through, particularly for children's outcomes, was financial stress. That was an important moderator between work and internalizing behaviors. So wrapping up and thinking about what our contribution to the literature is, I think one thing that we wanted to sort of really kind of make a stamp on is that we were able to sort of give attention to different types of economic hardship when existing literature has focused on income, and that perhaps these other markers do matter, not necessarily in the context of children's development, or in addition to just it's important to look at these features of a mother's economic circumstances. And I think for us as co-authors, we've thought about, you know, what are the next steps for us, and also for the literature is really understanding those mediating processes between, let's say, the interaction with work and a type of economic hardship and child outcomes, and are those mechanisms the same? Possibly not. And lastly, I would say that we argue that income is insufficient in sort of thinking back to our conceptual models and our theoretical understanding of this. There was so much focus on income, but I think subjective experiences is getting more attention, subjective experiences of inequality, as well as, I would say, I didn't talk about here, but your own perception of your work schedule and your preferences, because those matter in how you integrate work and family life. That's it from me. So I just want to say thank you for listening, and really looking forward to any comments and feedback you have.